Hey guys, I am here to answer all of your wild game cooking questions today. I get so many questions from you guys on my website at georgiapellegrini.com, and I love responding to you there, but I figure this is an opportunity for you to ask me in real time and for me to dig into some of my favorite recipes on the website. So here we go. We're just gonna jump right in. And I wanted to start out by talking about wild game in general and how it's different from meat that you get in the grocery store. So wild animals, they're athletes. They run freely through the woods. They eat a huge range of fruits and vegetables and animal proteins and vegetable proteins. And so they have to be cooked with a little bit more nuance than regular store-bought meat, which oftentimes is in a feedlot, doesn't have a great life, and it's important to think about where your food's coming from. At least for me, it's important, which is why I got into hunting to begin with and why I'm a big gardener and I love to fish and forage and just get my hands generally in the dirt. I think it's important for human beings. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how to approach wild game differently when you try it at home, because I think that everyone needs to try it. I think that we get used to eating the same things over and over again and sort of have a monolithic diet where it's, everything tastes like the next thing. Everyone likes to say everything tastes like chicken. But the truth is that, humans are meant to eat a great variety of animal proteins and vegetable proteins and fruits and nuts. And so I'm here to encourage you to do that. And, there's places online where you can get wild game. Oftentimes you'll have friends or family or uncles or grandfathers who have access to wild game. And this time of year especially, people are really looking to empty out their freezer to prepare for spring turkey season and also for fall hunting season. So oftentimes people are really getting into wild game cooking just about now. Sometimes you spend months and months hunting or gardening or fishing and getting all that produce and all of those harvested proteins into your freezer. And now is the time to make the most of it. So I wanted to dig into some of the recipes on my website together, answer any questions you have, and answer some questions I've gotten in the past few days even from readers, and also just through the years. I think they're important fundamental things. But like I said, wild animals are athletes. They run freely. They have a lot of dense muscle tissue. And so as a result, there's not a lot of marbling of fat in their meat the way there is with feedlot animals. And so that means you have less moisture to work with. So it's important to think about adding moisture back, thinking about brining in advance to make sure moisture stays in there. Think about ways that you can add flavor, impart flavor to combat or balance some of that gamey flavor. But I bet that if you spend enough time eating wild game, it won't even taste gamey to you after a while. I think we've gotten a little too used to eating things that all sort of taste the same. And as a chef, I just always think it's such an incredible opportunity to try new flavors. And I always say that, animals are a grand culinary adventure when they're from the wild, because no two animals are going to ever taste the same when they have been allowed to run freely and eat what they want. So it's truly a case of you are what you eat, and you certainly taste like what you eat when you're a wild animal. And as a chef, it's exciting because every new wild game that I harvest is an opportunity to play with that flavor. And, was it a squirrel feasting on acorns and pecans? Or, was it a deer where was that deer feeding? What's that environment? How can I play on those flavors and the ingredients in the environment? So I thought I'd step in and start answering some of your questions here, and feel free to ask them as we go along. The first one is about my buttermilk fried rabbit recipe, which if you haven't tried it, you better go try it. It's on my website. And for all of you guys, when you're looking for my wild game recipes, you just go to georgiapellegrini.com. You can do a keyword search at the top right, or you can head over to where it says recipes and projects, and you click on any recipe that you see. And when you click on that recipe, you'll see on the right-hand side of the website, there's a sidebar, and it's all categorized. And toward the bottom, it says wild game. So click on wild game, and up will pop every wild game recipe that I've ever written, and there are a lot. There's some in there that are not in my book, Girl Hunter, but then of course my book, Girl Hunter, has a lot of wild game recipes that are not on the website, so they complement each other well. So this question is from Travis Cotton, and he's asking a question about buttermilk fried rabbit. And what's so great about this recipe here, it's got buttermilk, it's got onion and garlic cloves, oregano and thyme. I've got some tarragon, which is one of my all-time favorite herbs. Smoked paprika, also something I use a lot. I just love that sort of smoky under flavor. Cayenne pepper, of course, you got your flour. You could, if you're gluten-free, you could find almond flour or some other sort of alternative. Garlic powder, onion powder, and salt and pepper. And you need a really good oil, which you want an oil with a really high smoking point. That's pretty important. You know, some people use oil that burns really quickly, and that'll actually impart a flavor. So you want a pretty neutral flavored oil, especially when you're making buttermilk fried rabbit. I like to go with just like a neutral vegetable oil. A sunflower oil is really great. It doesn't have a strong flavor. So Travis is asking, does the sprinkle of salt really help keep it crispy? You know, he said, I hate when my fried foods will wilt after cooking, and I couldn't agree more, Travis. And the reason that I'm a big believer in dousing it with salt at the very end is it's going to absorb all that moisture that you left in there after it came out of the fryer and help it maintain its crisp outer crust once it's come out of that heat. And you know, with all fried foods, it's tricky because they're really in the moment delight. So they don't taste as good the next day or even a few hours later. You want to eat them right out of the pan. So salt, super key, and putting that at the very end of the recipe is key as well. Just turn it over, 4 different sides, just keep turning it and just adding some, I like to use kosher salt. You could use sea salt, whatever you got on hand, but it's crucial at the end of any fried recipe that has a batter crust on it that you add salt at the end, because that's really going to help lock in that crispiness, and that texture and that crunch is what it's all about. All right, so the next question I have is from Joanne, and she's asking about the wild glazed turkey breast recipe that I have. It's a really popular recipe, and especially in the springtime during turkey season and also fall turkey season, it's a particularly popular recipe. What I love about it, it's got, whiskey, which, let's be honest, we all love our whiskey. And it's got a few other delights. I'm gonna see if I can pull it up for us here quickly. And the thing about turkey breast in general is that, it's a wild animal, like I said, so it doesn't have a lot of fat there. And I'm a big fan of trying to leave the skin on whenever you can. I know it's more work, it requires plucking. So if you don't have the skin, you're gonna need to add back fat, meaning you need to add back whether butter or some sort of source of moisture. This whiskey glazed turkey breast recipe is right on my website, once again, georgiapellegrini.com. It has butter, turkey breast, turkey stock, honey, which adds a little sweetness and a little tang with the balance of the whiskey, has whiskey, of course. It's got grated orange rind, which I think just adds a whole other level of sort of aromatics to it. And then of course you got a little cayenne. I see Robin's chiming in with any brining tips for waterfowl, duck, or geese. Yes, Robin, I actually am gonna get to that in 1 minute, because I'm a huge believer in brining for sure. So back to our reader question here. She's asking, let's see if I can find it. What sides can you pair with this dish? So, I think it depends once again on the time of year that you're making this. You could, if it's springtime, you want to celebrate all things spring. So you could do anything you could do spring peas or radishes. You could roast radishes. I'm a big fan of roasted radishes these days. You could do, roasted mushrooms. Sometimes there's spring mushrooms that come up. I love fiddlehead ferns. I love ramps. You could grill some ramps. They're like a wild onion that have a garlicky, oniony flavor, or just some bright greens. And then of course there's, the all-time favorites, which is like mashed potatoes, which is better in the winter or the fall, a little heavier, a little more comforting. You could do just some roasted potatoes. Some sweet potato would be amazing. Although I wouldn't want the sweet potato to sort of overwhelm this little mild sweetness that you get from the whiskey glazed turkey breast. So I'm a big believer in celebrating the environment that your turkey's from, celebrating the time of year, and thinking about how you can sort of play with those things as you're making your recipe. So find out where that turkey was hunted, Joanne, and then I would say honor that. Next question. Kara actually is was asking a different question about the same recipe, about the whiskey glazed turkey breast recipe. She said, I didn't leave the skin on our wild turkey when I butchered it. Would I do anything different in this recipe? Yes, Kara. Super important and super great question. So you'll need to put some fat on the breast if the skin has been taken off. And the reason you want to do that is that you don't want the moisture to evaporate outside of that turkey breast while it cooks. So I recommend you could do a layer of pancetta. You could do really thinly sliced bacon. Make sure it's thin because you don't want the flavor of the bacon to dominate. Don't get smoked, don't get anything flavored, just get a really neutral bacon, but thinly sliced. And then you could also do like a lardo, which is like a lard from the pig. But you can always remove it after it cooks, and I would recommend doing that because you really want to celebrate the flavor of the turkey. And then I would baste it with a lot of butter regularly. I'd like to go in there and scoop up with a spoon some of the butter and the whiskey and the honey that's caramelized with the orange zest, and you just spoon it over and over there. It's amazing. And then you could also, if you're really worried about it being dry, you could brine it. And I'm gonna get to some brining recipes in just a minute. Next question. Someone's asking about venison barley soup. I absolutely love my venison barley soup. I love all things venison. I think it's safe to say that everybody loves venison. It's probably the #1 wild game meat in people's minds. For me, I'm more of like a squirrel fan. I like venison, but I like, axis venison, something with a little more intrigue, or elk. And I love squirrel. I think it's some of the best meat in the woods. But venison barley soup is another incredible comforting recipe. And I can tell you a little bit more about that one. It's got, cubed venison, carrots, parsnips, turnips, sort of celebrating those root vegetables. It's got button mushrooms and onions, and I actually threw in some radishes because I love adding radishes to roasts and soups and stews. It's got rosemary, and it's got a stock. I love to make venison broth whenever I can out of venison bones, but you could use any kind of stock really. And then of course pearl barley. And at the end, when it's all done, I'd love to chop up some fresh herbs, chop up some flat leaf parsley. You could do tarragon, you could do dill, but just throw on some herbs to create some vibrancy and freshness at the end as you're serving it. So you've got Sue Ellen asking, what she wants to know what cut of meat you would use for the venison barley soup. So the key with any kind of soup or stew is you want to use what's called a third category cut of meat. A third category cut of meat is a muscular cut. In chef school, they have first category, second category, third category. A first category example would be like the tenderloin or the back strap, those really tender, lean pieces that have very little muscle or anything other than just pure meat and pure protein. A third category is what you put in stews and soups. So in my case, you would have, like a muscular cut from the leg or the shank. You could use the front leg, the hind leg, whatever you have, any of those scraps that you're not quite sure what to do with, that's not easily going to be thrown into the grinder for a burger or whatever it may be, or just a simple tenderloin. Save it for stew meat and slowly cook it, and it'll break down over the course of several hours, and it'll just be melt in your mouth, super tender. And all of you guys, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, now's your time. It's free, and I have all kinds of tutorials when it comes to meat. I don't know if you've noticed here, but there's a how-to on how to grind your own meat at home. It allows you to stretch your budget further, which is super important when you are thinking about buying animals. If you're not hunting them, going to the grocery store and buying a whole animal rather than its parts is a way more economical way to purchase meat. So I have a how-to on how to grind your own meat at home. You can make it into burgers and sausage, anything you want, and also how to quarter a chicken. It's the same technique for quartering any kind of bird, whether it's a wild duck or a pheasant. So that's another really important skill. So be sure to subscribe to this channel because I regularly have all kinds of tips that'll help you think about how to be more self-sufficient and pioneering and stretch your budget further and really how to make the most of your wild game meat. I even have some great venison meatballs and venison meatloaf recipe on this YouTube channel right now. And I think there's one other, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I'm all about the venison and the wild game recipes in general. So be sure to check this channel out for all kinds of other recipes. All right, my next question I've got is about my pheasant confit recipe. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with confit and what confit actually is, but just to give you a sense, it's something that people do oftentimes when they're trying to, they have a more muscular cut, for example, and they want to find a way to add fat back to it, keep it tender, and have it for to sort of melt off the bone. And it works really well with very tough meats because it cooks low and slow in fat. So with a pheasant confit, for example, what you do is you take pheasant legs and you cure them with salt and other flavorings. So in my recipe, for example, I've got 6 pheasant legs, a half a cup of kosher salt. It sounds like a lot, but it actually helps you, it helps the confiting process, which is the curing process. I also add a zest of 1 orange. I have 5 cloves, which I love the combination of orange and cloves. 5 sprigs of fresh thyme, which gives that aromatic herby flavor that it permeates throughout the salt as it cures. And then I've got pepper, and I've got juniper berries, which I love using in wild game. I'm going to get to a recipe in a little while that talks about another way to use juniper berries, which are incredible, very powerful, so you don't need a lot of them. And then I've got grapeseed oil, which I cook it in. But you could also use duck fat. The process for the confit is once you've cured it, you actually cook it low and slow for a very long time in fat. Duck fat, or if you don't have duck fat, you can use grapeseed oil. It's a little bit more affordable. And it slowly allows the meat on the bone to just fall off and become buttery and tender, and it's amazing. So my question that I'm getting here about this, let's get back over to her. She's asking, can I confit pheasant breasts in the same way? I have them in the freezer at the moment. Okay, Margaret, so the problem is that pheasant breasts don't have the same muscle that the legs do. And so as a result, you're going to not be able to use the benefit of that salt curing process. Now, you could slowly cook the breast meat in fat or oil, and you would have a very, intense, juicy breast, but I would say that it could become a little greasy. And so you really, really want to use this confiting technique with muscular cuts. It looks like it's traditionally done with duck legs. So you could do it with wild duck legs. You probably want to brine or marinate them first because it can be quite gamey, but you'll see it a lot in fancy restaurants. They'll use domestic duck legs, and they'll cure them, and then it's sort of this fall off the bone, buttery, melty thing. So typically speaking, Margaret, you don't want to use it with breast meat. You want to use it with muscular cuts of meat. If you look at my website, I have a wild boar rillette. I can't ever say it right. It's like roulette, I think. Wild boar roulette recipe. That's a similar technique where I cook wild boar cubes and in fat, and it slowly melts and turns into this incredible buttery thing, and you actually store it in a nice jar with the fat, and it's a wonderful spreadable consistency on toast. So look for that wild boar roulette recipe as well. A lot of the ladies that just went on my adventure getaway actually made it with the wild boar meat they brought home, and they loved it. All right, my next question I'm getting is from Guy, and he is asking about my recipe on how to cook a deer liver. Now, I think that liver in general is a very divisive thing. I'm a huge fan of liver. I have a great recipe also for liver mousse, which is out of this world. But this recipe for deer liver is simple. It's simply sauteed, and I'll give you a little background. It's a deer liver. You use salt and pepper. You slice it on a bias. A liver is you can see on this blog post, if you go to how to cook a deer liver on my website, just put in the search right here. You'll see what a deer liver looks like and exactly how to slice it. I have step-by-step photos. And you're gonna have oil. You're gonna use a white onion. You're gonna use mushrooms, and then you're gonna use vermouth, whiskey, and cream. And the most important part is a match, because you're gonna actually light it on fire and it's gonna give it a caramelized, the alcohol will light on fire and burn off and become a little caramelized. It's a really delicious recipe. People love it. It's probably one of the most popular recipes on my website. So I guess I'm just bringing liver back, which I'm happy to do because I think it's way underappreciated. And I think you could give it to people and you'd surprise them, especially with the onions and the cream in there. It has a wonderful sort of very rich flavor. You could serve it with toast, or put your toast in there like a French baguette, or maybe Italian bread, and just sop up all those juices. It's to die for. Now I'm getting hungry. And by the way, I'm going to post all the links to the recipes I mentioned here in the comment section, in the little description of this YouTube video. So if you're looking for them, just look below when I'm done with this video and I'll add them all and you'll be able to click through. And of course, I'll put a link directly to all my wild game recipe archives so you can just get right to them. All right, the next question I have is from... So actually, I should go back to Guy's question. I didn't actually answer it. Sorry, Guy. I just got into the recipe. He's actually asking, so I use vermouth, like I mentioned in the recipe, and he's saying, do I use sweet vermouth or dried vermouth? He said, I just scored my first buck, a nice 3-pointer. The liver is in the fridge now. First of all, congratulations to you, Guy, on getting your first buck. That's amazing. I will never forget my first hunt. And I would say to you, I generally prefer dry vermouth when I'm cooking. I love having on my kitchen counter a bottle of dry vermouth. I also love having a bottle of Marsala wine. Those are my 2 favorite cooking alcohols. And I think you just can't go wrong with either of those, and you'll just have delicious dinners for the rest of your life. So I would say opt for dry vermouth if you can, but either will work. All right, the next question I'm getting is about my braised wild boar recipe. It's from Nikki. So just to give you a little sense of this recipe, it's braised wild boar, and it's got a large leek, it's got carrots, mushrooms, onion, garlic cloves, tomato paste, Marsala wine, like I just said. It's one of my favorites, I've just proven it. And then you can have some stock. You could use beef broth, chicken stock. If you have any kind of wild boar stock or wild game stock, by all means use it. And then you can I actually add a little orzo pasta in there, but you could add rice or barley. You just do it. You do you, whatever makes you happy. So she's asking, Nikki is asking, she's like, I'd like to try this sometime this week. I've been using, I'll be using a relatively small bone-in shoulder, or what she's describing as a picnic roast. And I'd like to brown it on the stovetop and then finish in the oven. What temperature and cook time would you recommend? So, by the way, another thing you can do is just go into Google and you could just type in Georgia Pellegrini wild game recipes or Georgia Pellegrini braised wild boar, and you just pull it up, and here it is. It's a lot of step-by-step photos are here as well, so if you ever get confused about how things are supposed to look, there's step-by-step photos that will show you exactly how to do it. So the answer is, I'll just tell you exactly what you do. So basically with this wild boar recipe, you want to cook it, brown it on all sides, and browning meat helps you lock in the juices. That's important with any kind of braise that you're gonna do. So you brown it on all sides in an oil with a high smoking point, or ghee is another great oil to cook in. It's clarified butter that has a high smoking point. Brown it on all sides. And then I like to cook my braises or my roast at about 350 degrees, and it takes several hours. And it really depends on how many pounds you're using. So what I say to you is, I usually start with 2 hours, sometimes I go to 3. You just try it, just pull it out, take a look, see if it's fork tender, see if it's falling apart, falling off the bone, take a taste. It's all trial and error. Cooking should be about intuition. I never follow recipes, that's why it's hard for me to even write them, because it's all about what's in your kitchen air. And my grandma, she had this magic, and I can never quite follow her recipes perfectly because it's all about personal intuition. So start with 2 hours at 350 with your braises. See if they're falling off the bone. If they're not, give them another 30 minutes, test them again, try them out, and just keep rolling until you have it just where you want it. Okay, so we're up to brining now. Brenda She's asking, Georgia, I brined my turkey and now I want to roast it in the oven. What do you recommend for that as we don't have a smoker? So I have a recipe for turkey brine on my website. I also have one for pork brine. I'm a huge believer in brining, especially for wild game. And the reason it's so important is that it helps lock in the moisture. And like we talked about, wild game is naturally a very dry meat. So you need to find ways to add moisture back or lock it in. So brining also imparts flavor and it helps lock in the moisture into those cell walls. So let me tell you a little bit what's inside this brine. I have water, always important for brining. You want to flavor the water with, I have in this case, white wine vinegar. I've got brown sugar, I've got granulated sugar, I've got 1 cup of salt, mustard seed, garlic cloves that are crushed, black pepper, sprigs of thyme, bay leaf, and the peel of 1 orange and 1 lemon. I love this brine recipe. It's universal. It can work with so many delicious meats, especially with pork or wild pig or pheasant or wild turkey. You could even use it with quail. So generally speaking, with brining, you could even do it with duck, I would say, but I also like using a marinade with duck. With duck, I like to do something a little more Christmassy. Like I'll use red wine and I'll use cloves and garlic and I tend to opt more in the range of marinating versus brining. Marinating is really an acidic approach to breaking down the muscle and the toughness of wild game and meat in general, whereas brining is really about locking in the moisture. So think about your approach. I tend to do more marinating with red meat and I tend to do more brining with white meat. So something to keep in mind, but I've got recipes for both right here at georgiapellegrini.com. And like I said, be sure to subscribe to this channel because I'm going to be continually posting more wild game recipes over the coming months. I've already got some great ones here. So to answer your question, Brenda, yes, you could definitely roast it. You don't have to smoke it. I think I maybe suggested in this blog post to smoke your brined turkey breast, but by all means, go ahead and roast it. And smoking is another great approach with wild game meat because I think it helps, once again, keep in that moisture. So, all about finding ways to approach it without drying the meat out. All right. Next, I have a question from Olivia about my devil doves recipe. Okay, this recipe, if you make nothing else on my website, make this recipe, especially if you have someone who thinks they don't like wild game, because let me tell you, it will change their mind. And I'm all about changing people's mind when it comes to wild game, as you know. So this devil doves recipe is so good. And let me just explain to you what it is exactly, because it's gonna knock your socks off. So you take dove breasts, and I like to remove the breastbone. And once again, if you don't know how to breast a dove when you've gone dove hunting, I have a great video on my YouTube channel for how to do that, as well as on my website. It's really quick and easy. So you take dove breasts, and if you don't have dove breasts, you could use a small amount of quail, you could use a small amount of duck, you could even use a small amount of chicken if you wanted to. The idea is it's a small amount because these are gonna be bite-sized little appetizers. So you take dove breasts, and you take pitted dates that are cut in half. So you take dates without pits in them, just cut them straight in half with a paring knife. Now, you could also try prunes or apricot or another dried fruit. I just find that dates is the perfect balance of sweetness. Now, to that, what you're gonna do is you're gonna have your dove breast, your pitted dates, and then you're gonna have a soft goat cheese. I love goat cheese with dates. It's the perfect combination of sweet and salty. Now, if you don't want to do goat cheese, you could try blue cheese or gorgonzola or another soft cheese, but the key is that it's spreadable and it melts when you're cooking it. So it needs to be a fairly soft spreadable cheese. Then you're gonna have sprigs of thyme. And in this case, in the recipe that I have here, I've used strips of bacon. Now, this gets to the question of this reader, but she's saying, how long would you cook these if prosciutto was substituted for the bacon? I'm declaring war on the bacon wrapped everything trend happening right now. So, Olivia, I totally agree with you. I think it's a huge mistake that so many people just default to bacon wrapped items when they're cooking wild game. Jalapeno, cream cheese, bacon, cream and mushroom soup, all that stuff needs to go away with wild game. I will say that it works well here in this recipe, so don't completely reject bacon, but I would say if you're gonna use pancetta, which would be divine as well, I would say you can cook it for about the same amount. It's gonna be less fatty, and that's sort of one of the things that I love about the bacon aspect, is because you have that sort of fatty mouthfeel combined with the sweetness of the dates and then the aromatics from the herbs, and then you have the saltiness of the cheese. But basically you lay down either your bacon or your pancetta in little strips, and then you put the dove breast on top. Then you add a little bit of date and goat cheese and thyme, and then you wrap it up into a little package, and it's knock your socks off. You would do like 24 of them at a time on a sheet tray, and they crisp up in these little packages that you just pop in your mouth. Will blow you away. Amazing party appetizer. You could use it for game day. If you're watching football or have people over, just throw them in the oven, have them pre-wrapped, ready to go in your fridge, and just throw them in the oven, and they're out of this world. All right, I just got a few more here. We've got a question from Emma. She's asking about my bison pizza recipe. Now, what's great about this bison pizza recipe is that it uses the homemade pizza crust that I was taught by a woman who took care of me growing up. She's basically like my grandmother. I call her Auntie, and she makes the most incredible thin crust pizzas. So I have her pizza crust recipe here that you just need to have in your life regardless, and you can freeze it if you don't use all of it. And once you have this pizza crust recipe in your life, you can roll it out and add all kinds of wild game toppings. In this particular recipe, I used ground bison. You could also use ground venison, ground elk, ground turkey, ground duck. Once again, make sure you check out my video on this YouTube channel about how to grind your own meat, because this is another example of where it would come in handy big time. So she's asking if if I put the ground bison on the pizza, will it cook in time? And the answer is yes. So ground meat has enough surface area, it's very fine, it'll cook very quickly, it's a very high temperature when you're cooking thin crust pizza. I believe I'm cooking this at 425 degrees. So that's gonna be really quick to cook, and the ground bison, if you have a thin layer on the top, will cook very quickly, so you don't need to cook it before you put it in the oven. In fact, if you were to do that, I think it would be overcooked and wouldn't have that same flavor, especially if you were to use a different kind of ground meat like venison. It would start to taste pretty gamey. All right, so I've got two more questions about wild game. One is about my recipe for venison roast with red wine and juniper berries. I mentioned that I am a big fan of using juniper berries with wild game meat. And this recipe celebrates the venison backstrap, and I teach you how to truss it in the recipe. So how to really wrap it in twine so that it cooks evenly. Make a roasted twine package for cooking. It uses some pork fat, it uses garlic cloves, 8 juniper berries, which gives us this wonderful earthy aroma and flavor. It's very fall-like or winter-like. Bay leaves, thyme, black pepper, olive oil, teaspoon of salt, and then a full-bodied red wine. And then of course 8 strips of bacon, because I use those once again to keep the moisture in on the top. You could use lard, you could use strips of lard, you could use pancetta, you could use lots of butter, but you want to just make sure you give it a very well moistured surface at the top. So the question that he has here is, what kind of red wine would be best for this? You know, I don't spend a lot of money when I get cooking wine. I know people get fancy and they think that somehow that's gonna really make the dish, but I really am a believer in not wasting expensive good wine in the oven. So I would just say get a less than $10 bottle, or $10 bottle at most. Get a full-bodied red wine. I prefer them more dry if possible, because I think that the sweetness sometimes when it cooks down, the sugars can overwhelm. And that's all I can say. I mean, you can always ask someone at your wine store, but I would just say a dry red wine whenever possible, and nothing expensive. Don't waste your money. Okay, now this last recipe here is one of the all-time most popular. It's from Donald. His question is, I don't like liver, but I've always thought about heart, and I thought it would be good because it is a muscle. I tried to cook it once, but the interior of the ventricle and the large veins and arteries were tough. Okay, so Donald, so once again, guys, this is a recipe for how to cook a deer heart. We talked about how to cook a deer liver. This is how to cook a deer heart. And the amazing thing is that deer heart is delicious, and most people don't have the opportunity to eat it because they just leave it behind. And it's just so delicious. In fact, back in the day, the Native Americans, when they were hunting, they would actually eat the warm heart of their prey, of their animal, in order to inherit its spirit. Now, I'm not saying you need to do that in the moment when it's raw, but let me just tell you, it's really good when it's cooked. So with the deer heart, and to of course answer your question, Donald, you want to actually open up the deer heart, and I have step-by-step instructions here, and you want to cut out all of any kind of artery or any kind of cartilage. You're cutting it out and you're cutting away so you just have the meat, and it's very dense muscular meat. But what you're going to do to it is you're going to marinate it. It goes back to the red meat, marinate, white meat you brine. So you marinate it with balsamic vinegar, which is acidic, olive oil, which is also acidic. I don't know if most people know that. Rosemary is great because it has antibacterial qualities. And then salt and pepper. It's super simple. You marinate that. And I love to even do it overnight if possible. But once you've cut it, you've cleaned it, you run it under water until the water runs clear, you really spend time marinating it in all those acidic ingredients, then you just throw it in a pan, you sear it quickly. You don't overcook red game meat. You have to eat wild game meat that's red meat. Rare. There's just no other way. I'm sorry, you have to get used to it because quite frankly, it'll ruin the meat. It'll taste super gamey. But with the heart, you just sear it in a pan, brown it on multiple sides, and it's delightful. In fact, some of my good friends, their 6-year-old daughter is obsessed with it. So try it for your family. You'd be surprised. I think it's psychological sometimes for people. And one last question from Mike, and this is a general question. He said, do you have recipes for grouse? I think he's thinking for sharp-tailed grouse, I think. So I do. In fact, I'm just going to type in Georgia Pellegrini grouse recipe into Google, and I'll tell you what I get. It's been a while. I can't remember every recipe I've ever written. So I have a great recipe. Yes, this one. So I have a recipe for blue grouse with roasted apples and pears. It's incredible. Also have a recipe for partridge in an orange brandy sauce, and those can be interchangeable. And with all of my recipes, I oftentimes give you alternative meats. So if you go to the Wild Game Archive section, I'm going to include the link right here. Look at the choices, see if you can get some inspiration, and swap out meats. Use one meat for another meat, and you'll just see that it's a grand culinary adventure. And wild game meat is something that we should all try. So invite your neighbors over, invite your family over, and just see what a wonderful treat it is to break bread with people over something that you've worked so hard to bring home for dinner. So guys, I hope I answered some of your questions. Feel free to leave more questions here in the comments if you watch this when we're not live, and I'm happy and I'll do my best to answer whatever I can as we go along over the next few months. And be sure to subscribe to this channel. It's free, and I'm going to be posting more and more videos here in this whole category that I hope